Out of all of the Loyalist Space Marine chapters, the Raven Guard are masters at guerrilla warfare. They perform meticulous reconnaissance to identify the enemy weak points and strike hard with perfectly coordinated attacks. The chapter relies heavily on small, fast-moving units that can operate independently on almost any type of battlefield. But to best understand the tactics of the Raven Guard, we need to look at some of the chapter's most notable conflicts. And that's what we're going to do today in another episode of 40 Facts About the 40K Universe. If you're new to the channel, allow me to introduce myself. I am your host, Gersh1, your guide through the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40,000. For this entire week, I will be covering the Raven Guard chapter, so if you have any suggestions or questions about the Sons of Corvus Corax, please leave me a comment down in the comment section below. And if you enjoy this faction-focused approach to our lore videos, stealthily click the like button on this video. It helps it reach a wider audience, and it tells YouTube you want to see more 40k lore videos. But with all that said, let's get into 40 facts and lore on the most notable battles of the Raven Guard. I want to start off with one of the most recent major conflicts that occurred in the Castoral Noam sector. Sadly, the chapter suffered terrible losses during this campaign, but it highlights the Raven Guard's unique battlefield tactics when facing an enemy that outnumbers their ranks 1,000 to 1. Late in the 41st millennium, Wog Garagak struck the sector, taking over much of the manufacturing centers of the Imperium. The Imperial defenders mobilized to push back the greenskin threat, but the orcs were stuck in. It was left to the Raven Guard to help liberate the captured Imperial worlds. The Raven Guard task force was commanded by the renowned Shadow Captain Corvidae, who commanded elements from the 1st, 5th, 8th, and 10th companies. The 10th company alone provided 7 full scout squads, a significant portion of the chapter's recruits. The raid had 2 primary objectives: the elimination of Big Mech Buzzgob, the Wog's chief mech boy, and the destruction of the Orc fuel depot and refinery complex, which would cripple the Orc Wog and swing the war in favor of the Imperium. It came down to Chaplain Idith, who commanded a deep strike assault against the fuel depot and refinery. The Chaplain's forces encountered only light resistance and were able to plant their multi-charges and destroy the refinery in short order. With their task complete, the Chaplain and his command extracted via Thunderhawk. Shadow Captain Corvidae and the rest of the task force were waiting for confirmation of Buzzgob's location from the chapter's scouts when word was received of a massive orc force moving in on the hard-pressed Elysian positions. The 181st Elysian drop troops had been deployed on the planet to destroy a partially constructed Gargant and to kill as many orcs as possible, but would not be able to resist long under such a great assault. Corvidae was unwilling to stand by as the Imperial Guard troops were slaughtered and immediately led his forces in an assault on the Orc column, which consisted of orcs from the Goth clan. The Raven Guard assault proved devastating and stalled the Orc advance long enough to allow the Elysians to fall back to another defensive position and request evacuation. However, the respite was only temporary, for the Orcs merely paused to consolidate and bring up Stampas before striking at the Elysians once again. Corvidae once again threw the Raven Guard against the Orcs to give the Elysians more time, but hordes of Death Dreads, Killicons, and formidable Mega Dreads retaliated, and it cost the Raven Guard many lives. At the height of the battle, Corvidae's Land Raider Prometheus was destroyed by a Mega Dread, yet Corvidae proved it would take more than that to kill him and dragged himself from the wreckage. With the battle turned so heavily against them, Shadow Captain Corvidae issued the order to withdraw. Braving heavy ground fire, the chapter's Thunderhawks extracted the embattled Raven Guard. The surviving Elysians withdrew in their remaining Valkyries to isolated air bases and evacuated the planet. In the end, over 70 Battle Brothers of the Raven Guard lost their lives, and of the 2,400 Elysians of the 181st that deployed on the planet, less than 400 survived. To make matters even worse, the Elysians were not able to recover any of the 130 aircrafts from the planet, abandoning all of them to the Orcs. Determined to resist the Orcs of Wog Gargak, the Raven Guard deployed to the sector's capital of Forsar. Unfortunately, the planet was lost to the Orc invaders. The fall of the entire sector left the Raven Guard's own chapter homeworld of Deliverance in the warpath of the Orc Wog. Facing the threat of a full-scale invasion, the Raven Guard's Master of Shadows recalled the entire chapter to the Ravenspire. For this failure, Shadow Captain Corvidae is now serving 2 years in the Death Watch as penance for the failure of the raid of Castoral Noam. Another major battle that highlights the tactics of the Raven Guard is the hunt for Vuldorius. At the centennial feast in celebration of his ascension, Kuble, the Great Khan, the chapter master of the White Scars, announced his intention to bring to justice one of the greatest foes ever to have opposed the chapter, Kurnax Vuldorius, known to the White Scars as Bladespite. He was a demon prince and war leader, or Strike Master of the renegade Alpha Legion Space Marines, and as vile of a foe as any the White Scars had ever fought. Trillions of men and women had died when Vuldorius had unleashed the merciless horrors of the Blood Tide some 2,000 years earlier, and billions more had perished in a sacrilegious massacre dedicated to the ruinous powers of chaos on the worlds of Kento, Loran, and Blind Hope. Now, the Great Khan declared, Bladespite's triumphant reign of terror would cease. Castoral Noam, captain of the White Guard's Third Brotherhood and the chapter's 51st Master of the Hunt, was dispatched with his company and charged to return with the Demon Prince's head, or not at all. It was a hunt to last more than a decade. Though Castoral caught sight of his prey on the battlefields of the worlds of Zoran and Cavell, and almost came within striking distance in the choke underhives of Modana, chance always conspired to save Vuldorius from his deserved fate, and so the trial finally led Castoral Noam and his brotherhood to Quintus, a desolate imperial fortress world to the galactic south of Chogoris in the Ultima Segmentum. Quintus had only recently been one of the Imperium's chief bulwarks against the brutal Orc Empire of the Joggle Stars, but that was before the coming of Kernax Vuldorius, who had arrived with his Alpha Legion forces to discover the presence of another Traitor Legion warband, this time the Night Lords, already within system. Following a necessary period of brutal readjustment, Vuldorius joined both forces under his command. Through intimidation and false promises, the Demon Prince's combined warband had infiltrated and corrupted Quintus's planetary defense force, leading them to take up rebellions against the Emperor of Mankind. The White Scars found no mere warband of Chaos Space Marines on the world, but a whole planet ready to stand against them in defense of the ruinous powers as emissaries. But Castoral would not be so easily denied his prize. Leaving their strike cruisers in the outer system, the White Scars mounted their Thunderhawk gunships. Following rigorously plotted stealth trajectories, the attack craft slipped through Quintus's defense grid and landed amongst the blasted canyons southwest of the planetary capital city of Mankara. Castoral expected to have a battle on his hands to secure the landing zone, but he found no enemies, rather the unexpected allies in the shape of Captain Kaivan Shrike and his Raven Guard 3rd Company. Shrike had been on campaign in the Targus system when news of Quintus's fall to chaos had reached his ears. With the Targus battle zone swinging towards the victory of the Imperial forces, Shrike redeployed his own company to Quintus and had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Night Lord invaders ever since. The piloting expertise that had allowed the White Scars to make planetfall unobserved by the Quintan rebels had not been skillful enough to go unnoticed by Captain Shrike's forces, and the Raven Guard had mustered to meet the new arrivals. As dropships deployed the White Scar support vehicles, the two Astarte captains held a council of war, neither entirely trusting the other. The rivalry between the White Scars and the Raven Guard chapter went back many thousands of years, but both Shrike and Castoral knew that they had little choice but to set aside their inherent differences. The Alpha Legion and their treacherous Quintan vassals were simply too numerous for one company to defeat without the aid of the other, and so the Space Marines' battle plans had to be drawn accordingly. The following morning, before dawn, Shrike led his company in a surprise assault against the traitors garrisoned in the orbital defense battery some leagues west of Mankara. This was the method of war Shrike and his battle brothers had perfected against the forces of Wall Skullcrack, and within moments of the assault's beginning, the traitor forces were in disarray. A good portion of the complex was already in the Astartes' hands when Vuldorius, seeing danger, dispatched half of the Alpha Legion traitor marines and much of Mankara's garrisons as reinforcements. But Shrike had drawn his plans well, as the Raven Guard captain led assault squads into the heart of the complex. His remaining forces entrenched themselves on the perimeter, so it was that Vuldorius' tide of reinforcements crashed upon the bastions of the defense complex's outer fortifications, like the sea upon distant shores. The Alpha Legion's aspiring champion, directing the assault, was a canny foe, and held his deadliest troops back from the slaughter. Instead, he sent wave after wave of Chaos Cultists and traitor Planetary Defense Force troops into the guns of the Raven Guard, casually expending their worthless lives in search of a weakness to exploit. Such a weakness offered itself up when one of the bastions cracked asunder, broken by fire from Iron Soul, a massive bandblade tank manned by the traitorous Quintan crew. Seizing this opportunity, the aspiring champion led his reserves forward. Over 300 Chaos Space Marines of the Alpha Legion and the Night Lords flung themselves at the single point in the defense. The Raven Guard stood their ground, pouring bolter fire into the oncoming horde, but their numbers were thin and the enemy ferocious. Khyven Shrike emerged from the depths of the complex to lead a counterattack, and the enemy fell back wherever the Shadow Captain fought. But little by little, the Raven Guard began to give ground. The Alpha Legion aspiring champion roared his praise to the ruinous powers and drove his men forward over the dead and dying. It was then that the White Scars struck. Before Shrike had led the assault on the orbital defense complex, the White Scars had concealed themselves in the caves of the south. Now, with the bulk of the Chaos forces strung out, the White Scars launched their attack. With a throaty roar of engines, rhinos and assault bikes broke from the shadows and sprung towards the fray. The Iron Soul was the first to feel the White Scars' wrath. Though the Bandblade's commander bellowed at his crew, the massive tank could not turn swiftly enough to engage the new threat. Corsaro's vanguard, skilled bikers all, tore through the traitors that protected the Iron Soul's flanks, never once slowing their breakneck charge. The White Scars swarmed about the adamantium monster's flanks, targeting it with meltifire and its vision slits with flamers. One by one, the Iron Soul's guns were silenced, and the bikers spurred on forward to the embattled Raven Guard, leaving only a crippled tank and the slain traitors in their rear. Dismayed by the unforeseen assault of their flank and the swift demise of the Iron Soul, the traitors fled. The Alpha Legion fought on to the last, but the White Scars were upon them. Squads of bikers swept through the ranks of the Chaos Space Marines, blades and lances flashing. More White Scars disgorged from rhinos, bolters coughing death at the foe. By the time that Strike led the Raven Guard over the defense and into the fray, the outcome of the battle was no longer in doubt. Captain Shrike and Corsaro had no time for celebration. Vuldorius and his followers still had control of the capital city of Manakara, and if given time, would be able to fortify it further. Leaving a small garrison in the orbital defense complex, the White Scars took to the Rhinos and the Raven Guard to the Thunderhawk gunships. The Hive City's defenses remained a concern. Both Shrike's and Corsaro's companies had traveled light and could only carry a single Vindicator between them, the aptly named Thunderheart. Fortunately, the efficiency of Vuldorius' tyrannical rule over Quintus had not extended to basic maintenance. A salvo of Hellstrike missiles from the Raven Guard's Thunderhawk and a brief pounding from the Thunderheart Demolisher Cannon brought down a sizable segment of Mankara's outer wall. Before the traitor garrisons could react, the White Scars were already in the city. Not wishing to get caught in the brawl of vicious urban warfare, the White Scars fought from their transports, exiting them only to launch lightning assaults. White Scars' bike squadrons hurled through the streets and the alleys of Mankara, swarming whatever defenses were unprepared, whittling their opponents down through attrition without granting them the slightest chance to answer in kind. As the White Scars commanded the battle at street level, Shrike's Thunderhawks deployed squad after squad of Raven Guard to the upper levels of the city's many manufactorums and basilicas. True to their specialty, the Raven Guard swiftly and silently descended upon the unprepared defenders. Beset from above and below, the heretical defenders of the traitorous Planetary Defense Force stood little chance. Many threw down their arms and begged for mercy, but there was none to be had for those who betrayed the Emperor of Mankind. At the end, only Vuldorius and his personal bodyguard remained. Infused with a battle rage, the Demon Prince fought on against impossible odds. Many battle brothers fell to Vuldorius' wrath that day, but the vengeance of the Space Marines would not be denied, and they pressed forward to finish their hated foe. Encircled, outnumbered, and trapped in the shadows of the Grand Cathedral of the Emperor's wisdom, Kernax Vuldorius finally met his end. The Demon Prince did not fall quickly or easily to the servants of the Emperor, and his bodyguard of corrupted and twisted Chaos Space Marines fought without fear. Yet the outcome was not in doubt. At last, even Vuldorius' unholy strength, born of Chaos Undivided, could not prevail against the sacred determination of his Astartes enemies. Pierced and pinned to a fallen statue of the Emperor he had long ago betrayed by Shrike's talons, in perhaps the rarest instance of true poetic justice, Vuldorius could not escape the vengeance of Corsaro's ancient power sword, Moonfang. With one terrible blow, the White Scars Khan cleaved the Demon Prince's head from his shoulders, erasing the foul stain of his existence from the material universe. A month later, with Quintus now in the firm hands of Imperial Guard forces sent from Talaran, Corsaro and Shrike exchanged their final words and went their separate ways once again. Shrike returned to the Targus battle zone to face the orcs, once more in the never-ending vigilance required to keep the Imperium's border safe. Claiming Vuldorius' head as his prize, Castoral Noam returned to a hero's welcome in the great fortress monastery of the White Scars on Chogris, known as the Palace of Quanzhou. Kernak's Vuldorius' head soon joined the long line of other foes of the Emperor that lined the approach of the palace. Each captain took with him the respect of the other and the glory of a hard battle won, perhaps the beginning of a newly reforged brotherhood between the chapter that had for so long been a rivalry. Another major conflict that highlights the Raven Guard's ability to destroy the Xeno threat is what happened on the planet of Baran. The planet of Baran was a lush and bountiful world newly colonized by the Imperium of Man. For decades, humanity fought hard to push away the countless hordes of feral orcs roaming their planet. They built fortified cities that acted both as a defense and a staging ground for extermination campaigns against the fractured greenskin settlements. The Imperial colonizers became experts at laying waste to countless snakebite encampments, as these feral orcs did not possess the advanced technology of their spacefaring cousins. Instead, these feral orcs relied on primitive weapons and squig farming to wage war amongst each other. Capitalizing on the constant infighting amongst the greenskins, the colonists settled the majority of the planet and were well on their way to turn Baran into an angry world. Only the deep forest of the planet was safe from Imperial assault. This is where the greenskin population was now concentrated. As time went on, the Imperium began to notice significant technological leaps within the greenskin hordes coming out of the forests. Before any substantial expedition could be organized, countless cities reported abnormally large orc raids coming from the forests. It wasn't long before the Imperial High Command realized that these weren't simply large orc raids, but they were entire feral orc clans rushing out of their old homes. What was causing this mass exodus didn't matter to the Imperial Governor or his High Command. They were focused on surviving the wave after wave of greenskin hordes as each clan ferociously assaulted the fortress cities of Baran. The orcs' improved technology and relentless assaults were proving costly for the Baran siege masters. As the colony cities came under even more intense assault, the defenders realized their position was ultimately hopeless if they didn't receive support. Governor Azabera was able to dispatch what reserves he had from his capital city of Indera to the most isolated colonies, but realized that this was only a delaying measure at best. Azabera called upon the Raven Guard on their moon of Keran for aid. This request for support came to Shadow Captain Moradius, who chose not to deploy to the embattled fortress cities, as his forces were too few to effectively aid in the defense of so many isolated sieges. Captain Moradius was more concerned with what was driving the orcs from their forest than he was with the feral orcs themselves. Determined to discover the cause of the orc attacks, the Raven Guard returned to Baran, making only brief contact with the governor before they struck out for the deepest, wildest sections of the Baran's forests. As they searched the forest for signs of orcs, the Raven Guard discovered every greenskin settlement had been destroyed, every lair rooted out, and there was barely any orcs remaining. Something had destroyed the orc camps and driven them from the forest. The captain knew that such spontaneous and orchestrated activity across the entire planet was not likely to have been the result of the orcs' own infighting. With little else to discover in the forest, Moradius recalled his scout teams and took his warriors into the Vultus Plains, a barren region of the steppe plains where even the orcs did not establish settlements, choosing instead to roam the plains, riding giant boars, squigots, and other creatures as warring nomadic tribes. After a week of hard marching across the plains, the Raven Guard at last encountered the orcs, but the captain was not seeking to drive yet more orcs towards the fortress cities, and so broke off contact after a brief skirmish. After withdrawing from combat with the nomadic greenskins, the captain ordered his scout marines to shadow the orcs and watch for signs of the force that had driven the orcs from the forest. Days later, the scouts reported back that the greenskins were under attack. Without delay, the Raven Guard rushed to the orcs' tribe's location aboard 6 Thunderhawk gunships. Despite their haste, however, the orcs were wiped out by the time they arrived. The Raven Guard instead came face to face with the Eldar of Craftworld Bael'tan. Well versed in the slippery nature of the Eldar, Moradius ordered an immediate assault, striking at the Eldar forces rapidly and reaping a heavy toll in Xeno lives. The Eldar had apparently not planned for engaging the local Imperial forces so soon, and certainly had not counted on the presence of Space Marines. The The Eldar force was unnerved by the speed and maneuverability of the Raven Guard assault. The Eldari had gotten used to the brutish and uncoordinated attacks of the Feral Greenskins, and so when a powerful enemy that specialized in lightning strikes fiercely opposed the Eldar, the entire force was scattered and uncharacteristically began an immediate defensive withdrawal. It seemed as if though every tactical maneuver performed by the host was predicted by the Space Marines, as scout units appeared almost as if out of thin air, ready to rain a hail of gunfire at the foe. The few Eldar warriors forced to engage the Sons of Corvus Corax were butchered in melee combat. It was as if the tables had turned, and the Eldar were now being dissected, little by little, similar to how they were slowly and methodically murdered by the Orcs. Just when the engagement favored the Xenos, the Astartes would disengage and allow the Eldar to flee. But moments later, a new fresh unit would be waiting in ambush, ready to continue the conflict on more favorable terms. Captain Moradius used his perfectly trained tactical genius to precisely predict the Eldar weak points and arrange the moving assault around the target. While some of the fresh scout marines did fall, the casualties were completely tipped towards the Xenos. At times, the Eldar attempted to seek shelter, but it was impossible to hide in the open plains. The best the Eldari could do is attempt to lose the Raven Guard while crisscrossing the carcasses of Orc Squigots and giant boars. Perhaps it was the curse of their Primarch, but the Raven Guard seemed to enjoy this cat-and-mouse game. They chased their enemy close enough to inflict damage, but far away enough to give the Eldar the hope of escape. The captain understood that the Raven Guard would have to secure victory, but the experience his scout marines were obtaining was priceless. For hours, the Astartes and the Eldar fought a running battle as the Space Marines slowly began to outnumber the Xeno force. They struck at the Eldar from all sides, until the Xenos at last fell back to a circle of standing stones. These were ancient monuments from the days of the Eldar Empire's rule over Baran. You see, before the Imperium, even before the Orcs, the planet of Baran was an Exodite colony. These Orthodox Eldari had settled this planet a long time ago, during the Eldar Empire's golden age, and the Imperium and the Orcs were the real intruders. Nevertheless, resolving to crush the Eldar army decisively, the Raven Guard committed to the attack, but this was what the Eldar had wanted. As the Astartes closed in on the remaining Eldar forces, webway gates opened up from around the ring of standing stones. The Raven Guard found itself encircled by an entire Eldar swordwind that had been rampaging across the surface of Baran. Though they fought bravely, the Space Marines held out for only a few hours before they were utterly exterminated. The Eldar managed to open an entire webway gate on Baran's plain, from which Eldar Titans could emerge to join the battle. The defenders of Baran were swept from the world, which was reclaimed by the Eldar, though the Imperium and the Raven Guard vowed to retake it someday. And finally, let's take it back all the way to the Great Crusade. One of the terrible actions that solidified the Raven Guard's horrible reputation amongst the forces of the Imperium of Man occurred before the 19th Legion united with their Primarch. It was known as the Battle of Hell's Anvil. The Battle of Hell's Anvil was typical of many of the 19th Legion's early engagements. It created a savage legend that their Primarch Corvus Corax would later seek to repress, one that exemplified both the similarities in tactics and the differences in character of the warriors that made up the 19th Legion and later the Raven Guard. Hell's Anvil was the name given to a massive fortress situated on the planet of Baratrum. For almost 5 years, the Imperial army had fought a futile battle to destroy the overseers of that planet. They had since surrendered their humanity, and capturing the world's prodigious mineral wealth was important for the new Imperium. Thousands of lives had been spent, and yet the Imperial army was unable to secure any foothold in the sunken metropolises of Baratrum. Eventually, a fleet arrived, bearing 3 full chapters of the 19th Legion, under overall command of the Shadelord, Arkas Val, the master of the Legion at that time. Accompanied by a sizable contingent of the Luna Wolves, the force changed the nature of the campaign. The Task Force strike cruiser began a concussive bombardment directly above the previously unassailable subsurface fortifications of Hell's Anvil, heedless of the collateral damage to the planet's subterranean population. The massive tectonic force of the bombardment shook the planet to its core, causing severe damage to many of their underground cities. Into this hellish landscape, Shadelord Fal ordered 3 regiments of the Thorsian Voltigeurs, a unit attached to the Imperial Army detachment that had so far failed to assault the fortress. It would be their job to lead the vanguard assault. Soon they were beset upon by hundreds of frenzied worker drones, with casualties mounting and the fortress still spewing forth its berserker defenders. A desperate request was sent to the 19th Legion for reinforcements, and went completely unanswered. Waiting until Hell's Anvil had been emptied, the combined Space Marine Task Force descended into the bowels of Hell's Anvil. The Headhunter Company of the Ashen Claws chapter, led by Shade Captain Keran, were able to hack and blast its way into the interior of the beleaguered fortress. They ruthlessly hacked down the hulking overseers. After hours of fighting, the 19th Legion finally discovered Hell's Anvil's titanic plasma reactors. After facing the largest of the overseers still alive, they planted melta charges amongst the reactor's delicate containment fields, and retreated as suddenly as they had struck, back into the upper levels to detonate the charge. On the surface, Shade Lord Fowl and his forces had put the frenzied drones to the sword. The destruction of Hell's Anvil saw the swift collapse of the planet's resistance, and despite the damage that various factory wardens had sustained, the envoys of the Mechanicum were able to restart production with only a minor delay, feeding the Imperium's expansion and continued conquests. Sadly, the Imperial Army regiments bore the brunt of the assault's bloody cost, losing over 100,000 soldiers, whereas the 19th Legion and the Luna Wolves only suffered a few hundred casualties between them, mostly amongst the Ashen Claws. This cost, though high, was less than might have been expected from a drawn-out siege, and the battle was lauded as a mighty victory for the advancing crusade. It also established the reputation of the 19th Legion as the harbingers of death for those units of the Imperial Army assigned to their support. This remnant of their heritage as slave masters and raiders in the dust plains of old Earth did not find favor with the Raven Lord when he joined the 19th Legion, and this practice was only forgotten, both within and without the Legion, after long years of campaigning under Corvus Corax's guidance. But even once reunited with their Primarch, the Legion at first suffered another terrible stain of their illustrious history. It was known as the Keran retribution. The conquest of the Keran sodality remains a black mark on the records of the Raven Guard, a campaign whose details, long suppressed by the factions within the Official Militaris, shows the Raven Guard as directly responsible for the campaign's delay and the excessive casualties recorded by the Imperial Army units assigned to them for fighting. The Raven Guard task force arrived in the Keran system with a force of almost 30,000 legionnaires, and twice that number of soldiers of the Imperial Army. They made swift progress with the conquest of the Thousand Moons of Keran, immense void cities that circled the otherwise planetless primary, remnants of a power long lost to mankind, whose isolationist inhabitants were ill-disposed to bend the knee to the Emperor. Directed by the keen tactical acumen of Corvus Corax, the Raven Guard turned the Keran's greatest strength into a fatal weakness, for though the void cities were many and their defenses strong, each fought a solitary war, separate from aid and unable to support the defense of their fellows. Rather than attempt a grand campaign, besieging the entire star system at once, or challenging the combined fleet of the Keran sodality for void supremacy in the system, the Raven Guard used mobility and stealth to strike a single moon at a time. It was on one such moon, designated as Zenith 3112, that the combined task force assaulted in good order. All was well, until the city's Arc Comptroller unleashed a terrible weapon from the Age of Strife, long held in stasis in the depths of its city. An enigma phage of terrible potency that rendered men into creatures of rage and hunger, devoid of all reason and memory. The Raven Guard suffered little ill effects, but the ordinary citizens of Zenith 3112 and the mortal soldiers of the Imperial Army were reduced to frothing, mindless hordes that numbered in the tens of thousands. Immediately, the Raven Guard found themselves beset on all sides, and were forced to put down those that they once called allies. They granted them the mercy of death, as the 19th Legion swept the Void City clean. In the aftermath of the fighting, it was discovered that the Arc Comptroller had used the massacre of his own people to make good his escape aboard his personal shuttle. The Raven Lord was incensed, and vowed that the Arc Comptroller would be forced to account for his actions. The task force abandoned the persecution of Keran's conquest, and instead focused all of its effort into locating the escaped Arc Comptroller. Discovering the object of their wrath, he was tracked to a remote outpost, drifting in the outer reaches of the star's boundaries. The Raven Guard turned to its Morat kill cadre to bring murderous vengeance to the Arc Comptroller. Once aboard, the Morat quickly went on the offensive and methodically began to leave a bloody trail of corpses in their wake. Making no attempt to reach the Arc Comptroller, the surviving kill cadre made their way to the lone hangar and destroyed all of the station's transports except for one to make good for their escape. The Void Station was then pushed towards the system's star. It took over 4 solar hours to fully break up, as the sun's fiery embrace blistered and seared the station's hull plating. Corvus Corax stood and listened for all 4 hours, as the Arc Comptroller raged and blustered, and finally pleaded over open Vox channels, only leaving when the station molten collapse cut off his final screams. The Raven Guard had avenged their sacrifice on Zenith 312, but in doing so, had granted the remainder of Keran's defenders time to consolidate their defenses, and without their support, the Imperial Army fleet had suffered badly as they attempted to hold the line. The Keran campaign, which should have been swift and painless for the expanding Imperium, would rumble on for almost another 7 solar months, and would cost many thousands of lives, as the price of the 19th Legion's need for retribution. And that's the lore on some of the most notable Raven Guard conflict. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk tomorrow. This is Gershwin with One Mind Syndicate, signing out.